Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're getting into a really significant legal case. We're talking about NNAMDI KANU.
Yeah, the IPOB leader. His extradition, the trial. It's definitely complex.
It is. And to help us unpack it, we're focusing on a recent analysis from Barrister Njoku Jude Njoku. He's a human rights lawyer based in the UK.
Right. And our goal really is to dig into his legal arguments. The core question he seems to be asking is, did the Nigerian government follow the law, both its own laws and international law, when bringing KANU back?
Okay.
So we'll be looking at what Barrister Njoku says about Nigeria's Extradition Act, the Constitution, Kenyan laws too, and things like the African Charter.
Trying to make sense of the legal side without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. Let's see if we can clarify the main points of contention.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. KANU's return from Kenya. Barrister Njoku raises some pretty serious points here. What's the fundamental issue?
Well, the core of it, according to Njoku, is that KANU's transfer from Kenya wasn't done legally.
How so?
He argues it was basically a forceful removal. It didn't have the required judicial sign-off.
Right.
Which, he says, violates Kenyan law, Nigerian law, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights.
And he backs this up. He doesn't just say it, he points to specific laws.
Oh, yeah. For Kenya, he mentions Article 29, that's about freedom and security, and Article 47, fair administrative action.
Okay.
His point is those rights were just ignored. And then in Nigeria's constitution, he cites Section 35, personal liberty, and Section 36, fair hearing.
So fundamental rights in both places were allegedly bypassed.
That's the argument, that the way it happened just disregarded these key protections.
And wasn't there also something about the actual extradition agreements between the two countries?
Yes, that's another layer. Barrister Njoku points out there are treaties, formal agreements between Kenya and Nigeria.
Okay.
These agreements spell out exactly how someone should be transferred for legal reasons. There's a process.
The legal procedure they're meant to follow.
Exactly. And Njoku argues that the way KANU was brought back basically just sidestepped all of that.
So potentially illegal under those specific treaties too?
Potentially, yes. It's not just about the individual's rights, but also about, respecting the rules agreed between countries.
Okay, so that's the extradition part. Now let's shift to the trial in Nigeria itself. The Supreme Court gave it the go-ahead, but Barrister Njoku disagrees quite strongly, especially with something Justice Garba Muhammad said.
Yes, that's a really key part of his analysis. He directly challenges the Supreme Court's view, or at least Justice Muhammad's stated view, that while there's no specific Nigerian law saying you can't prosecute someone brought in illegally.
So the argument is the law doesn't explicitly forbid it.
Kind of, but Njoku argues that reading it that way completely misses the point of Nigeria's own Extradition Act.
How does he figure that? Does he point to specific sections of the act?
He does. He brings up sections 3, 7, 5, and 15.
And what's their significance?
Well, none of them say, word for word, if you kidnap someone, the trial is off.
Right.
But, Njoku argues, together they build a whole framework. They set out the legal way to bring someone back for trial. They talk about due process, protecting the person's rights, limiting force.
So the act describes how it should be done legally.
Precisely. And Njoku's interpretation is, look, if the state can just ignore that entire legal process laid out in the act.
And then just say, well, no rule specifically says we can't try him now.
Yeah. It makes the Extradition Act seem kind of toothless, doesn't it? He suggests it's like missing the forest for the trees, ignoring the whole purpose of the law.
So the idea is the process itself was flawed from the start, according to this view, and that taints what comes after.
That's the essence of it. Can justice, really be served if the way you got the person into court was itself illegal? It's a fundamental question about the rule of law.
Okay. Then there's another twist of the actual charges against KANU. They weren't always the same, were they?
No. Initially, it was about treasonable felony, but later the charges shifted more towards terrorism allegations.
And how does Barrister Njoku connect this shift to the legal issues?
He brings up something called the principle of specialty.
Specialty? What's that?
It's a standard idea in extradition law.
Yeah.
Basically, it means you can only try the extradited person for the specific crime they were extradited for.
Ah, okay. You can't extradite them for X and then try them for Y and Z.
Exactly. So Njoku argues that since KANU was brought back, allegedly forcefully, and not for these specific terrorism charges.
Which apparently relate to things done outside Nigeria.
Right. Trying him now on these new charges seems to violate that specialty principle.
So it raises questions about why he was brought back versus what he's actually being prosecuted for now.
It certainly complicates things, yeah. It adds another layer of legal questions about the fairness and legitimacy of the proceedings. According to Njoku, it looks like the goalposts have moved.
Okay. Now, Njoku also looks beyond Nigerian law, right? He talks about international law violations.
Yes, definitely. He points back to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights.
The one Nigeria has adopted into its own law.
That's the one. He mentions Article 4, protection against arbitrary deprivation of life and security, and Article 7.1, the right to a fair hearing.
And the argument is the way KANU was rendered from Kenya breached these.
Yes, because it allegedly happened without any due process. So these fundamental rights, recognized internationally and domestically, were violated.
Any other international frameworks mentioned?
He also mentions the Commonwealth extradition frameworks. The argument there is similar, by allegedly resorting to forceful abduction instead of using the established legal channels.
Nigeria didn't meet its obligations under those agreements either.
That's the contention. These frameworks exist to ensure transfers happen legally and orderly between member states.
It really sounds like Barrister Njoku sees a pattern here, actions potentially conflicting with laws at multiple levels.
I think that's fair to say.
And he seems worried about what this means for public trust.
Very much so. He expresses concern that if the highest court doesn't seem to fully uphold these legal standards, both local and international, well, it could really shake public confidence.
Confidence in the courts being independent and sticking to the Constitution.
Exactly. He uses a powerful phrase, something like, justice, if it must stand, must not be built on a foundation of illegality.
That's a strong statement.
It is. It taps into a core legal idea, common in many systems, that the process matters just as much as the outcome. You can't get to a just result through unjust means.
So the worry is that maybe, in this case, the desire to prosecute is overriding the need for proper legal process.
That seems to be Njoku's underlying concern, that prioritizing jurisdiction, just getting the person in court, over how they got there, undermines the rule of law itself.
Now, interestingly, didn't a lower court, the Court of Appeal, have a different take on this back in 2022?
Yes, that's a crucial contrast Njoku highlights. In 2022, the Nigerian Court of Appeal actually discharged KANU.
Discharged him? Why?
Their reasoning was precisely that his right to a fair hearing was breached because of how he was brought back to Nigeria.
So they agreed with the kind of arguments Njoku is making now.
It seems that way. Njoku suggests that Court of Appeal ruling was actually aligned with Nigerian law, Kenyan law, and international standards.
But the Supreme Court overturned that decision.
Correct. The Supreme Court reversed the appeal court's ruling. And Njoku describes this reversal as prioritizing domestic executive convenience.
Meaning what the government wanted.
Over the rule of law. He says this created a deep controversy right within the Nigerian legal system.
Wow. So you had the Court of Appeal saying one thing based on these procedural issues and the Supreme Court saying another. That really shows the legal disagreement.
It absolutely underscores how contentious this is, even among senior judges in Nigeria.
And Njoku clearly thinks the Supreme Court's final word here could, set a bad example.
Yes, he warns about a dangerous precedent.
For future cases.
For future extraditions or similar situations involving bringing people back across borders. The concern is it might weaken due process protections for others down the line.
And potentially damage Nigeria's standing internationally.
Potentially, yes. If other countries feel established legal norms aren't being followed, it could attract criticism and affect cooperation. It's about the long-term implications.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap Barrister Njoku's main points as we've discussed them. First, the extradition itself, he argues it was illegal, violating laws in Kenya, Nigeria, and international agreements.
Right. Lacked judicial authorization, forceful removal.
Second, the trial's legality in Nigeria. He questions it based on the Extradition Act's principles, even if no single line forbids it after an illegal rendition.
Yeah, arguing it undermines the whole act.
Third, the changing charges from treason to terrorism, raising issues with the specialty principle.
That you should only be tried for what you were extradited for.
Fourth, violations of international law, like the African Charter and Commonwealth rules.
Breaching fundamental rights and agreed procedures.
And finally, the bigger picture concerns. Eroding public trust in the judiciary, undermining the rule of law, and setting a risky precedent.
Exactly. His analysis paints a picture of real tension between the government's actions and established legal principles.
And the way this tension gets resolved, or not resolved, could say a lot about judicial independence and the rule of law in Nigeria moving forward.
That seems to be the core implication he's highlighting.
It certainly leaves you thinking. When you consider all these arguments about process and legality, it really makes you reflect on, well, just how vital is sticking rigidly to due process, especially when national security or serious charges are involved. What's the right balance between state power and individual rights, and what happens when that process is questioned? A lot to chew on there.
Definitely food for thought.